like to welcome everybody to our today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. We're going to talk about corn diseases. Will corn leaf diseases be a continuing threat to Minnesota corn production? So just want to remind everybody, these sessions are brought to you by University of Minnesota Extension and generous support from the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. I'm Liz Stahl, Extension Educator in Crops here out of the Worthington Regional Office. I'll be moderating today, and we have Dr. Dean Malvick. He's our U of M Extension Plant Pathologist, and Ryan Miller. He's an Extension Educator in Crops out of Rochester. So with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker today. Dean, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Glad that you're here this morning. And so as you've heard and you see, the topic is corn leaf diseases. And the question that's come up, will they be a continuing threat to corn production in Minnesota? And how big of a threat will they be? And when will they be a threat? And those are the things we'll talk about briefly today. It's a large subject, but I'll cover some of the general information that answers some of these questions related to this. And then we'll go on with Ryan presenting some data from his field studies this past summer. Okay, so what are we talking about when we're talking about leaf diseases? Unfortunately, the list is not short. We have many different leaf diseases that can affect corn and have at times in the past. And the ones that are more problematic, I've put in bold here, at least those that have been most problematic recently, those being tar spot, southern rust, northern corn leaf blight, and Goss's wilt. Prior to this, gray leaf spot was a really significant disease and still is at times, south of us, south of Minnesota, across more of the central corn belt to the east. Eye spots, occasionally a problem in Minnesota, as physoderma is. And curvularia, which I will mention, is a relatively new problem in the U.S. and first really confirmed in Minnesota just this past year. So we have a number of different diseases that certainly can affect our crop. Fortunately, we don't see them all the time. And as you all know, it's been inconsistent over time. And that raises some of the questions that have come up. And so the first one we'll talk about is tar spot on corn, which, as you're all aware, is a relatively new problem, just first found in Minnesota in 2019, but has now spread across much of the state, as well as much of the corn belt. Now, many of you have seen this map, but it shows again where tar spot has been found at some point in the last 10 years. And so the counties, whether they're gray or yellow, indicate that it's been found there at some point. And the yellow indicates those counties where it was reported in 2025. And as you can see here in Minnesota, we've had tar spot confirmed and reported across most of our corn production counties, with the exception of the Northwest. And hopefully it doesn't spread anymore, but we know it's spreading up and been found on the North Dakota side of the Red River. And so it's definitely spreading, and we expect it to continue to spread. The fortunate thing is, in most parts of the range where it's distributed, it has not caused significant yield loss. It's been at relatively low levels. And the exceptions have been, in the initial years, the area in the southeast, that's noted roughly by that maroon oval, shows where tar spot was most severe, causing the biggest problem. And that's still been where it's been most common. But now, as you look over time, 2024, the disease was most severe just above that. The most severe cases I've heard about were around Cannon Falls in that region. And this past year, some of the more severe fields I've heard about were up closer to Monticello. So again, the disease seems to be widespread, as we know, but the areas where it becomes severe is driven by weather conditions that we don't really fully understand yet. So what are those risk factors? Temperature is relatively low. These are averages over an extended period, ideally 60s to low 70s. Ideal temperatures, but we know we have a few warm days. We can still get plenty of tar spot. Moisture is favorable for tar spot, but to a point. There's been inconsistent information collected and developed on this. Based on a study looking at a large number of locations across the Midwest, they found relative humidity between 70 and 90% favorable, not the real high humidity sticky days that we sometimes have. But another study in Indiana found relative humidity greater than 90% favorable. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. And I think there are other variables that come into play. And they also found in Indiana, July rain amount negatively correlated. So if there's more rain, there was less tar spot and vice versa in July, but more rain was favorable in June and August. And I think, based on these different kinds of results found in different places, I think we still have a lot to learn about which specific conditions favor and are needed for tar spot. But I think we all know part of the challenge here is getting the specific weather variables measured for particular sites. And that's where some of this is still lacking on a broad scale. The other thing we need, I think, is the disease that gets started by mid-July. And for those of you that like to look at risk tools and try to assess what might be happening based on what we know about the disease, there's a tar spot risk tool on the Crop Protection Network website. There's a risk tool there for tar spot. I'd say take a look at it. If we found at times it over predicts tar spot, the risk higher than it really is in particular areas where I've looked. But the model is constantly improving, so it is something to look at for sure. So looking at the overall disease cycle, if we look at this part right now, just this lower circle that I put here in red, obviously the fungus is out there across much of the state now in the residue. The question is, where and when the spores will be produced and what conditions we need to incite the actual infection on the corn when it starts to grow and is growing into the early to mid to late summer. And those are some things we're understanding more, as I've alluded to previously, but I think we still have a lot to learn. But not only do the spores in the field make a difference, but we know they can be windborne as well. And that's something that we still have more to learn about. And the other point is we need to get it started early enough, like I said, because the initial infection usually results in relatively low levels of disease. It's the secondary cycling, the secondary production of spores and secondary development of disease. It's kind of indicated on that top picture there from the left to the right, which really causes much of the damage to corn. And you can also see that in this picture I took of a corn leaf in the lower left here, showing large lesions that were part of the initial infection, and the secondary infection resulting in all these other smaller lesions that are, or stroma that are growing. And how do we manage this? I think we all know fungicides can be effective if they're applied at the right time. And we don't want to apply too early because these can really ramp up and spread later in the season. Rating to R2 may be beneficial if we don't need them earlier. And again, apply based on the risk of tar spot, which is partly based on reports from the region and the kind of weather conditions we're talking about. And the other thing beyond fungicides, of course, are resistant and tolerant hybrids. All the seed companies are making progress in developing and identifying those hybrids that hold up best to tar spot, and planting the best ones can definitely make a difference now. And for fungicides, I think many of you know that each year there are trials done by plant pathologists at universities primarily across the country. And this data is compiled into these tables put together by the Crop Protection Network to give a relative level of efficacy of different fungicides for different corn diseases. So this was just updated a few weeks ago, and this is the update here, and you can find it on that website. So again, it shows the efficacy for different diseases, including southern rust, including tar spot. So that's as much as I want to say here about tar spot. We have a lot more to learn, but we know the risk is there across much of the state now based on the increasing distribution. Of course, in the last year or two, southern rust has been the bigger concern in many parts of our state, especially the south. And I also put a picture here of common rust, just to keep in mind that we have two kinds of rusts. Common rust is nothing new. Southern rust is a much newer problem at the levels that we are concerned about. And just as a reminder, how do you tell them apart? Southern rust is favored by warm and humid weather above 80 degrees. Orange to light brown pustules, mostly on one side, the upper side of the lift surface, has increased a lot in Minnesota, as most of us know. Common rust has been here, for a very long time. Usually doesn't cause a big problem. Like all rusts, they don't survive here over winter or in our region that they've blown up from the southern US. By the time the southern rust spores come, it's usually warm. By the time the common rust spores, it's usually too warm for them. In other words, it's favorable conditions for southern rust often when those spores arrive, and not so favorable for common rust. And I just put together this little chart here just to indicate over the past 10 years, and again, I want to say these numbers here are not hard numbers, just indicates a general trend. For the past 10 years, we've been able to find southern rust, someplace in the state on and off most years at very low levels. But suddenly in 2024, it increased substantially. In 2025, even more. And the questions come up like, why is this? And what does this hold for the future? Now, what happened in the past for southern rust, unlike most other corn diseases, does not help us predict the future because, again, the pathogen doesn't survive here. But obviously, having seen this disease at significant levels in at least parts of the state over 2 years, raises the concern that, maybe it's a continuing trend, although that is yet to be determined. Now, the southern rust disease cycle is a little different, right? If you look at the two maps here on the left and on the right, you can see again, supporting what I already said, the spores have to blow in from the south. Maybe along the Gulf Coast, maybe even south of the US border. I think there's some uncertainty where the initial spores come from. But regardless, the disease gets initiated first in the deep south of the US. Spores are produced and they continue to progress northward. And then once again, the infection starts, you get a cycling of the disease that can happen in as little as 7 days. In other words, after infection, these pustules develop, they can produce more spores and incite more infection. Happens much faster for southern rust than it does for tar spot, for example. So that's why this disease can progress so quickly. And just to show again where we know the disease was developing this year, to show a general pattern, again, on June 8th, it was reported deep in South Texas and nearly along the Gulf Coast there in Florida, Alabama. You can see the red counties where it was reported. And by June 29th, it was reported much further north here in southern Arkansas and parts of Mississippi. And then we jump up to July 17th. It was being reported in central Iowa, as well as southeastern South Dakota. And then we jump up to August 4th. We're seeing more and more reports from Minnesota as well, and reports from across Iowa. Again, showing the northern distribution, spread, and development of this disease. Of course, we need favorable conditions for this to develop, and this will not likely happen every year. And this shows the final distribution that was reported. Again, remember, this map only shows those counties where the disease was reported and actually confirmed. I'm sure it was in many other counties. The report was never came in, and we couldn't put it on the map. So what are the risk factors? So first of all, what we know is most corn hybrids have low resistance to southern rust. However, there are different levels of susceptibility among hybrids. So that is definitely something to note. Favorable conditions for the disease. To get this to develop again, we need to have the rust developing in states south of Minnesota, by mid-July, maybe even a little earlier. So again, we can look at this. We can look at the corn IPM pipe website, where those maps that I just showed you came from, for reports of rust and where it's developing. Again, if we're seeing lots of it in, say, southern Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, early July, for example, mid-July, and we have rainy conditions up here, and northern flow of winds, certainly we see the risk here as well then. Again, the spores have to blow into Minnesota, and the disease has to get started probably by late July to get really severe damage enough to cause yield loss. So what conditions do we need? 6 hours of leaf wetness, like to do, high relative humidity, and temperatures of at least 80 to 85 Fahrenheit. How do we manage it? Again, we don't have hybrids that we can pick that are highly resistant, but again, we can have hybrids that definitely suffer less from it. Fungicides can be very effective. Unfortunately, there's no clear economic threshold for establishing applications. There are loose thresholds out there, loose ideas, but no hard and fast rules. There's a lot of factors are involved in those thresholds: the corn growth stage, the yield potential, the threat or observations of rust in the region, again, what we just talked about. And we need those environmental conditions, of course, for a long enough period of time that favor rust development. So applying fungicides between VT and the Malvick are 3 stages. And when the disease has been detected, are most beneficial at protecting corn yield and slowing down southern rust. And that's as much I want to say about that, to cover some of those key points. The other disease, of course, that we saw at high levels in many fields, especially in southern Minnesota, was northern corn leaf blight. And there's nothing new about this. We've seen periodic outbreaks of this on and off over the past 20 years. Again, we need the right weather conditions. This is a widespread pathogen in most fields. I would say in most fields, again, if we go out late in the summer, it's easy to find a lesion or two like the one shown in the picture on the right, top right. Now, that's not a concern. It shows the pathogen is there, but it doesn't result in any yield loss at all when we see a few of those lesions. The concern is when we start getting lesions on leaves looking like this, that can then progress even further to cause the kind of damage we see in the lower right. And this is a disease, again, it's residue-borne. It's surviving in the fields right now is the tar spot pathogen. And like the tar spot pathogen, it can be blown in from other fields. So, tillage can make a difference, but it may not make a big difference if there are other fields within some reasonable distance where spores can blow from. And of course, we need the right conditions. Again, cool, wet weather is what this likes. Whoops. Optimum temperatures, 65 to 80, not that different than tar spot. Maybe this can handle a little bit warmer, and dew on leaves for about 5 hours. So like most diseases, the earlier it gets established, the more damage it tends to cause. How do we manage northern corn leaf blight? Number one, plant resistant hybrids. Virtually every hybrid has strong resistance genes that confer resistance to northern corn leaf blight. So I put an asterisk by that because those resistance genes are effective against certain races of the pathogen. There has been a long-held question about, are new races developing locally or regionally or even more broadly that can overcome some of those major resistance genes? And that could be one of the reasons why we see outbreaks of the disease. Although I have to say, nobody's ever answered that question definitively. The bigger factor, obviously, that results in the disease is just the right weather conditions that enable infection and disease development and spread. Tillage and crop rotation can make a difference. And again, fungicides can be very effective if they're applied at the right time. And again, in that table that I showed you, there's a table there for northern corn leaf blight as well. The other disease I want to briefly mention is Goss's leaf blight and wilt. So I think many of you know this is a significant problem across parts of southern Minnesota, especially the southwest, 10 to 15 years ago. There were problems with it elsewhere as well, but around that time period, this was a significant problem. Partially because a lot of our common corn hybrids were very susceptible to this disease. Now, many of you probably have not seen this much, if at all, in the last 10 years, because most corn hybrids now have high levels of resistance. But I'm bringing this up because now there have been multiple reports of much higher levels of this in fields, especially in west central Minnesota and into South Dakota, than folks had seen for years. I can't explain for sure why that is, but it could be because some of those hybrids are not as resistant as they should be. And again, this is a disease we can manage quite well with a good resistant hybrid typically. And so we need to be vigilant about that, because what this shows is the disease is out there. The pathogen is there in many areas. And if we start putting a vulnerable, susceptible crop out there, we might start having problems. And again, managing this, number one, plant resistance. And that's the main thing we can do. Crop rotation is good if that's feasible. And then this pathogen can also affect other grasses. So this could be also a source of inoculum that could infect corn ultimately. And again, just showing side by side two different hybrids inoculated the same way, showing very different levels of disease development and significant differences in yield at the end of the season as well. Just to make the point that resistance is extremely useful for this disease. The last thing I want to mention is the one I mentioned earlier, that there's a new disease in Minnesota too. We have all the other corn diseases that we've always had, but we have new ones coming in the state as well. Now, fortunately, these pictures here were not taken in Minnesota. I took these when I was on a field trip looking at crops in Mississippi this past late summer, just to show you what this disease can do. But even here, they don't consider it a real significant problem because it tends, I believe, as I understand, to come on too late typically to cause a lot of damage to yield. But nonetheless, we found it in Minnesota this year. So it is something else you might see. And so as you're scouting fields, one more thing you might notice. Even though, again, we don't think this will be a major problem that'll affect yield, but again, we'll learn more about this over time. And with that, as we started this, will corn leaf diseases be a continuing threat to corn production in Minnesota? I think the answer is yes, but not every year or in every field. And the other question, of course, is how big is the threat? A lot of these diseases we can manage. We can manage them with timely fungicide applications, resistant hybrids, etc. So again, the risk is there. It's not consistent. And it depends on weather, hybrid, and more variables that sometimes we don't understand well, all the factors that we need to get diseases to develop to really high levels. So with that, I will stop, and we'll have time for questions here a bit later. So Ryan, you could take over and show your data.
Great. Yes, thank you, Dean. Yeah, why don't we can do the questions at the end here, but it'd be nice to make sure we have enough time here for you, Ryan, just to show some work that you've done in Rochester, looking at different fungicides and effect on diseases.
Yeah, so we'll take a look at some practical work we did in the field, and I think we're going to echo a lot of what Dean just talked about, and particularly in regards to tar spot and southern rust. And I think that should become clear as we move through this. So we've been doing this field project for a few years with partial sponsorship from Wiffle Hybrids. So thanks to those guys for supporting this work or whatnot. We had for this project, we've got two hybrids. So that's an important piece of the puzzle here. We've got two distinctly different hybrids. And then we've got 6 fungicide timings that we do. We keep an untreated check as a comparison. Then we kind of progress through the different timings. So we start with an at-tassel timing, and then we have a 2 weeks after tassel. So that's that. You'll see these symbols as we move through it. 2WAVT is 2 weeks after tassel. 5 weeks after tassel, and then we move into some sequentials to kind of cover our bases as far as fungicide applications. So our sequentials are a tassel and 2 weeks later, and then a 2 weeks after tassel and a 5 weeks after tassel. All of this is replicated in small blocks, plots. They're very different than if you folks are familiar with some of our herbicide work where we have large alleys. This is tied up in a tight block of corn, trying to create kind of field-like conditions for that might be more conducive for disease development. And so That's what we did. As far as the treatment, we use 7 ounces of Veltima for every treatment timing. That's applied at 20 gallons per acre, 60 psi on the ground. We do take some ratings then later in the season as far as disease severity, and that happens later in the season, as well as then we monitor and take yield on all of these plots. So 2023 was an interesting year. It was a drier year, probably not as conducive for major disease development, but we did have something interesting happen. Right after tassel or at tassel, we had a major hail event which caused 60 to 70% leaf loss, and then via estimate of our corn. And so that would roughly correlate to probably about a 40% potential yield loss at that point, because we know at tassel the corn's not producing any new leaves, and so when you lose your leaves and your machinery to produce grain, as so to speak, you're really going to take a hit on yield. And so our general recommendation has always been, don't apply a fungicide in response to hail damage. Generally, that's just not a good idea. I know the diseases that come in sometimes after a hail event tend to be bacterial in nature, and the general recommendation is don't apply in response to fungicides. So we've got a case study here where at tassel we had this major hail event, and we put a fungicide on within 3 days of that hailstorm, and so that's kind of an interesting thing. Now, that said, I think early season hail damage, it still is prudent to keep scouting those fields, because we're going to produce new leaves. Say you had an early vegetative hail leaf loss event that was 60, 70%. Certainly that corn plant's going to recover and produce leaves, and those leaves are susceptible to some of these foliar diseases we've been talking about, and might need a fungicide application eventually in response to those to foliar disease that might show up later in the season as we get into the reproductive stages. So this is what the hailstorm looked like. It is severe. Beans didn't take it as bad as the corn, but the corn was extremely shredded. And again, this was a drier season, so it wasn't as conducive to seeing disease develop. And we really, when I came in later in the season and looked at what was remaining of those leaves, focusing in on the ear leaves to do a rating, we didn't see any disease present in this field. So we did put on fungicide, though, at the various timings, and all of my figures are going to be set up the same way, so I won't take time each time to explain this, but I'm going to try to get my laser pointer up. So starting on your left, that's our untreated check. As you move across the screen, we kind of go out in timing. So here's your tassel timing, 2 weeks after, 5 weeks after. And then we get our sequential, which is this first one's going to be VT followed by 2 weeks after VT. And then the final is the 2 weeks after tassel followed by 5 weeks after. Big take home here is we didn't see any response in yield to fungicide after this hail event. So the fungicide went on, in this case here, right after that hailstorm at tassel, and it was no different than the untreated check. So sort of a validation of our old recommendation, so to speak. We did see difference between the two hybrids this year, but again, a little bit more variability with this one. Yielded lower, no differences amongst the fungicide treatments here. So 2023 take home, again, just kind of highlighting the fact that that huge hail event, massive leaf loss right at tassel, really kneecapped our yield potential. And so we saw a pretty significant reduction in yield. And then the fungicide really provided no return, and we had no disease pressure. So it's kind of a good story, I guess, from that year. So fast forward 2024, this is another lower severity disease year. So this is some disease ratings from these hybrids in treatments at the end of the season or near the end of the season. And I guess the big take home here is very low disease severity. But we did see differences between the hybrids. So if you look at the untreated checks, there was clearly some differences in how tolerant these two hybrids are. And so I think when folks suggest a hybrid is more resistant than another one or more tolerant of disease, certainly that seems to be the case from our experience in this year, even in a low severity year. If we look too, even in this low severity year, we were able to use a fungicide and reduce levels of disease. So even in a year where we don't see massive disease, certainly the fungicide applications can affect the severity we're seeing later in the season. So this one was an interesting year because if we just focused in on the untreated check and the at-tassel application, folks would get excited. You do see a difference here, the average yield, different. And when we did a mean separation test, we could find a statistical difference. Where it gets interesting, though, is we know we have all these other treatments out in the field, and so as we move that application out into the season, the average is still higher in this case, but now we start to not be able to separate those statistically, and so as you move out though into 5 weeks after tassel, the response here, the average is a little bit higher. Again, not statistically different, and so putting dollars and cents to this is kind of risky. But do take into account that this fungicide application, the 7 ounces of Veltima, is probably dependent on application costs and what you're paying for product, is going to run somewhere between $30 and $45 an acre to put this fungicide application on. So that has to be taken into account when we start looking at these numbers. And again, that's risky when we start not being able to separate these 2 weeks after, 5 weeks after from our untreated check, So I just want to show everything. If we just had these 2 treatments, we'd get all excited, and certainly we're probably in the money on that treatment. Now, where this story gets even more interesting is when we look at the other hybrid, because none of those differences are there. There was some more variability with this in terms of yield. It yielded lower. So there's the old yields. And so this one just really had kind of a no response to fungicides. So in my mind, this is the same year, low severity disease year. It's looking like one hybrid has some potential to respond. In this other one, clearly no response to the fungicide. And so that's kind of an interesting point. That you're kind of shaking the dice, so to speak. If we don't know how we can predict whether a hybrid's going to have a response or not, pretty risky. All right, so 2025, totally different year. We had unfortunately used 2 different hybrids in this year, but the same design, so that we had everything randomized and replicated. 2 different hybrids. We did have a lot more disease. Early on, we had greater severity of southern rust, and then late in the season, we saw an increase in severity of tar spots. So at the end of the season, both diseases were quite prevalent and severe as far as their presence on leaves. And I'll show you some of that information here in a second. Big take-home message here is with the appropriately timed fungicide use, we were able to protect 20% of our corn yield with fungicide use. So when we're seeing these diseases and we're scouting for them, we can't be scared to commit to using a fungicide in those cases because they can protect yield. This farm, this is a highly productive environment for corn. We're targeting 300 bushel corn yields, and so when we have disease move in like this, it's important to probably in that case use a fungicide. And we'll show you some of that data. So early, like Dean was saying, in kind of that mid-July-ish time frame, we were starting to see southern rust, and we picked up a very small incidence and very, very low severity of tar spot at that point in mid-July. But where we were seeing the southern rust was on the outside edges of the field and the lower canopy. Real significant disease presence on those outside edges, lower leaves, upper surface. You could find it with ease. But as we move through the season, so this is kind of that mid-August time frame, and this is an ear leaf of about untreated check where we were going to put on our 2-week after tassel fungicide application. And so you can see that there's a cause for concern here. And I think if I was scouting a field and I saw this at that timing, if I'm looking at a 60-day grain fill window, and I'm seeing that on ear leaves, certainly I'm going to consider scheduling a fungicide application. Interesting though is look at the tar spot. Relative to the southern rust, not very severe, but you can see some of these stromata that have been here a longer time. And that's I first found tar spot in kind of mid to late July in this canopy situation. So again, picture just kind of showing why I think southern rust played a bigger role in some of the response we saw to fungicide in this field. So this is a leaf 5 weeks after tassel. There was going to be a fungicide applied to this plot area. This is the ear leaf. You can see a high severity of southern rust here. We kind of looking at this, we kind of missed the boat, I think, as far as the fungicide timing. But it was interesting. We'll show you the data in a second. You do see some more increasing severity of the tar spot in this case. If we look at the application we made at 2 weeks after tassel, where we're going to follow up with a sequential application at 5 weeks. So this had a fungicide 2 weeks after tassel, and now it's going to get another one today. You can see the difference in southern rust severity. But also, I kind of found it interesting that the tar spot severity is somewhat similar. So interesting. You can see, though, that the fungicides were working earlier on, and that this 5 weeks is kind of getting too late. So we'll show you the data quick here. This is our first hybrid. So your untreated check, 183 bushels. And then if we move out through our timings, our at tassel application was the best. Technically wasn't any different than the 2 weeks after tassel application, but it did have the best average yield. Move out to 2 weeks, a very good response. Your 40 plus bushels here. 5 weeks after tassel, I just showed you those pictures. We missed the boat, right? We're back down pretty much the same yields as an untreated check. This one with the sequentials, you look at them, you really didn't need a sequential application. Those are very similar yields. The other thing that I didn't show here is that these sequential applications, when we ended the season at harvest, the grain moisture was substantially higher than even some of these single well-timed applications. So you're looking at an extra 4 or 5 or more points of moisture, and so it adds a little bit of risk, I think, in terms of the economics of that whole situation. So you've got 2 fungicide costs, and you got some wetter grain, things to consider at least looking at that. So this is our other hybrid. So this one just did yield better in an untreated sense. So if we look at that 183, 205, so hybrid difference. This, if I showed you pictures of this, and I got those later, we'll probably skip those today, but this one did look like it had more tolerance to the diseases in the field when we didn't have a treatment. And when we added the fungicide into this onto this hybrid, it looked even better. I mean, it was really clean with this at tassel timing, and again, very significant yield protection. But as we move out across the season, you can see that at 5 weeks after tassel, statistically, we're not any difference. I know the average, you'll say, well, it was still worth it, but dollars and cents wise, it starts to get a little bit more challenging. I mean, to give you any certainty with that. But so as we're moving forward, you can see that the response kind of decreased. And again, with this one, if we look at the sequentials, I can't separate this at tassel versus the tassel 2 weeks after application. Statistically, they're the same thing. I can't separate those numbers. The averages are different. And so people will probably want to debate me on that thing if we were just looking at averages and not using the statistics. Again, it's kind of interesting. But again, this grain did end the season wetter, and this is not a cheap situation. When we're putting these fungicides on, I know a lot of folks with using some of the aerial application vectors are paying $40, $45 an acre for a similar application. So something to consider. You know, do I want two applications, or is one really well-timed application sufficient? And so I don't know. We can debate that. All right. Well, I'll wrap up there. I had some more slides. I hid those just so that we could save time for some discussion on some of what has been talked about today. So,
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And Dean, too, we'll have questions for you, but one question for you, Ryan, here. We did have a question about, and I know you have this information about the disease levels. Can you give us a feeling for what the disease ratings were for, like the southern rust and tar spot? And the question actually came up when you're showing the 2024 data. So I don't know if you have it for 2024, but I know you had it for 2025, just looking at the difference in response between the years.
yeah. So I showed the pictures in 2025. I thought it did that create more of a visual kind of show. The difficulty is that you try to rate these. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and it's time consuming. And really, what would be interesting is if you spent the time to rate this every week, it would give you a better picture of what disease was most severe when, and start to kind of indicate as far as what might be more important. Because at the end of the season, my severity readings, I'm trying to find these here.
If I remember it, they were like 40% was on some of those,
40-ish,
right?
yeah. And the one more resistant hybrid was like 35. So 35 versus 45 on an untreated for tar spot. And I know I had some data too on southern rust.
So that
Yeah.
was so that's pretty significant, right? I mean, because usually aren't like even with the fungicide trials when they're talking about a high level of disease, and Dean, maybe you know that is I sort of thought that was like 5% was a high level. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, well, there's been enough data to show that across the region, if you get about 5% severity for tar spot, that's when you start seeing yield effect in many cases. And again, that's going to vary depending on hybrid, but that's kind of a rough number.
So back to the timing then, Dean. So that year what we had low disease severity, I know I showed some 5% severity, but that was happening when we were very close to black layer. So it's this whole, what's just
Yeah.
such a mystery is like why some years things explode. And I know this winter I was showing some data where my first detections of tar spot in 2024 were earlier than 2025. But in 2025, we saw this disease develop with way greater severity, albeit late in the grain fill period, than we did in 2024. And the major differences were some of the things you mentioned, where we had greater precipitation early. Temperatures were warmer in the field, but then if we look at the later season, we also had more frequent measurable precipitation in August in 2025 versus 2024. And we saw the temperatures kind of cool off a little bit relative to some of the warmer temperatures we had earlier in the season. So there's some kind of dynamic at play that would be nice to be able to forecast or help predict things. It's been interesting to watch.
well, and getting back to that severity, so when you're saying like 5%, are they saying that that's kind of a, not that we really necessarily have economic thresholds, but is that kind of a trigger then that, hey, maybe you want to spray at that point?
Well, yeah, this is tar spot I'm talking about now, but yes, I mean we might want to start even a little bit before that. If there's that level of disease on an ear leaf, we might want to hit it before that actually. But that's the level where we start seeing responses often if it gets to that level.
And we had some questions come in earlier too, because I know like Ryan, your work showed spraying at VT. There's a lot of people putting fungicides on earlier. I mean, do you guys want to comment on that? I know in our area, a lot of those applications seem to run out of steam. Like, what kind of residual activity can we expect? Do we want to do anything ahead of VT or?
You know, that we need to collect more data on that too, but I think the data from across the Midwest indicates pretty clearly that we tend to get a better response if we wait to VT on average, or depending on the disease in the year, maybe a little later. Those early applications have not yielded consistent results from what I've seen. That doesn't mean they don't ever yield results, good results, but not as consistent as the later applications.
And is that kind of consistent across diseases too, that window of waiting till VT, because you mentioned northern corn leaf blight and, we've
It's,
got southern rust tar spot. Is it kind of around the same window you're seeing?
it seems to be for all those diseases. Yes.
Okay, well, that's encouraging at least. Now I had some specific questions here. We had one question about going to southern rust here. They were wondering about, the slide looking at the life cycle of southern rust, and it said there's like a few exceptions of overwintering. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, they're not talking Minnesota, right?
No, it only seems to survive on a living plant, a living host. So we need living corn for this to be producing spores and able to reproduce and then ultimately spread. So that doesn't happen anywhere near Minnesota or Iowa, right? So there's no information that would contradict that at this point.
Dean, I wonder about we're kind of right that time where in some of the southern states they've got a corn planting happening now, or maybe even a little bit earlier than we're
Yeah.
at right now. They're kind of first planting and then they carry on later again. But I wonder, like, is there do they report the presence of southern rust in the on prevalence in those fields, and could that be used as a kind of a first indicator that, well, if we get the right weather?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that map I showed you, that started early June, I think, where the first reports from like southern Texas and along southern Alabama. Um, so that's when they started to see it there. By the time the crop was big enough, I think, to be really obvious. I can't say for sure if they weren't out there scouting earlier, they might have been able to see it early. I don't know, but those were the first reports that came in. But yes, I think we can use that information to help us understand our risk. Although we have to factor that into all the other variables that play as well.
Yeah. Here's a question too that came in. Are there diseases where it's too late to apply fungicides once you detect them? So maybe looking at this, the protection aspect. I know we talked about that in soybeans when we were talking about soybean rust and things like that. But yeah, once you detect it, is it too late for some of these?
I would say for corn, again, what do I mean by detect? If we're diligently scouting and we find just a few lesions, a few stroma, I don't think it's too late for any of these diseases. If we
Okay.
wait too long and it really starts to develop, especially that secondary cycle, then it can be too late to get a really big benefit from a fungicide application. Um, if we think about soybean and white mold applications, that one's a little different, I would say. That one's harder to detect in some ways, the early infection. If we wait until white mold is obvious in a field, then it's too late to get a big bang for our buck on a fungicide application. But that's also harder to scout for in many ways.
Good point.
I'm gonna just share a picture again on my screen, and so when I don't know, and Dean has a lot of experience with this too, that when you're looking for tar spot, this is some examples on the left is from 2024. That's the first stroma I found, and that was early to mid-July. On the right, those are two examples that I found this year. Okay, so it's really difficult, but would you call that, Dean, a bigger stroma? I mean, it's not real big, but it's I mean, is that our initial infection that's going to cause all the issues later? And it's hard to believe because this is really challenging to
Yeah,
find,
that's that is the challenge, I guess. To expand on that question, Liz, it's not always easy, right, to find the diseases, especially if we have large cornfields. They don't always develop along the edges where we can readily scout for them. And so the size of these stroma, like you're showing here, Ryan, that doesn't make a big difference. These can produce plenty of spores right here. They don't have to get bigger. The initial infection was smaller and they've expanded to this point. So, but yeah, their very earliest infection is hard to find.
Challenging things here. Well, so some of the questions here are coming on return on investment. The cost of fungicides, and the return on investment is, well, why are corn fungicides so expensive when return on investment is so hit and miss? Is a question. But yeah, and so related to that too, wondering about generic products. Has there been research done on that? Does that help with the cost?
Yeah, so I did a study with a number of different generic products on corn this past year. I didn't show it because I didn't have enough disease there. This was at Rosemont, Minnesota, straight up north from Rochester. The disease did not develop there at very high levels at all, neither southern rust nor tar spot. It was there, but at low levels. The previous year, I had much higher levels of both diseases in the same field. So even though, we had rain throughout the summer. So the main point is I tried a bunch of different generic products and they didn't really show much in terms of disease suppression because there wasn't enough disease to measure suppression.
When you want to have the disease, it doesn't always show up, right?
Yeah. But what I can say is that was part of a larger trial done across many states in the Midwest. And all those data are going to be pulled together and summarized at some point. I haven't seen all the summary yet. I assume at some of the other locations there was more disease.
Well, and that ties in with, because we have another question, wondering, Ryan, why you picked Veltima as a fungicide, in Iowa State's head quilt. Basically, again, the Crop Protection Network, that pulls together all university trials, correct, throughout, because, you can't possibly look at every single product. So that is pulling in university data across the Corn Belt, basically, correct? And so that's really a nice resource. I don't know if you want to comment about your decision on Veltima here, Ryan, but
Well, so yeah, the Veltima decision it's pretty common product for people that were using fungicides with some of these timings, and then it standardized this trial. So I think, well, we had a location at Waseca, and then the other states had the same timings, and hybrid's relevant for their areas. And I believe they also used the same product combination just to kind of simplify things and keep everybody on the same page. So you could kind of isolate that variable, I guess, and make it the same across locations. Locally, though, so the disease situation was pretty prevalent this year, and I know people are using different fungicides, and a lot of different things worked for folks. And I'll be looking forward to seeing some of those results that Dean was talking about, just to kind of get a better handle on what should work better, because people are making choices to use different products, and certainly some folks saw really good results too this year that weren't just using Veltima, but that's what we used for our project. And I think the other big thing here is this whole application cost is significant, because the product can be quite variable what you pay for, as far as per ounce or gallon. But it's probably only half or maybe even less in some circumstances, the cost of some of the applications. So, it can get expensive based on how you're going to apply it.
well, and we had a question come in here, again, talking about fungicide. This is at registration. People could submit their questions. People were wondering about, is there a benefit to putting a fungicide in liquid starter at planting? That's one of the questions that had come in. I don't know if you got any comments to share on that.
Well, there's a product they're probably referring to. I have not done any work. We had talked about maybe trying to piggyback onto one of the nutrient management products where they could use something like this. Never followed through with that, but I'm not familiar with any positive results there. But there is a product, and I know, Dean, we chatted about this at some point, but
Yeah, it's being used various places for sure. It's a soil applied fungicide, and I think we need to collect more data, but some results are showing positive outcomes from using it against some diseases. That I have to look more at that, see which ones responded the best. But of course, one of the challenges is it has to have enough internal transport in the plant and residual to protect the plant late in the season. And there's some evidence to say it can do that to some extent. But I think we need a little more data to say if that's really good practice or not overall.
and so, Liz, one of the things we'll likely look at this summer with kind of setting up a similar project is that V5 is the proposed timing, so an early vegetative sort of application, not a soil applied, but in the same kind of application sequence. I do get a little nervous with certain fungicide and surfactant products when we're approaching tassel, but not 100% tasseled. There have been some situations where various products can cause some ear deformation and some issues with that. So be a little cautious with some of those at tassel applications. I think the labels are pretty explicit on how to apply those and what timings to avoid, but certainly something to watch too if you're thinking about timings and some of the questions and things that can come up.
And I see a note from Angie Peltier here too, works up in Crookston, but when she worked in Illinois, she did some work with that with an in-furrow fungicide application, did not see an impact on that. And then also did some work at the V6 timing. That was before tar spot, but also showed no yield impacts. But yeah, lots of great information, but I'm looking at the time here, everybody, and we should get stuff wrapped up here. But hey, thank you, Ryan and Dean, for presenting today, and thank you everybody for attending. And like I said, there'll be a short 3-question survey here at the end. If you do want more information, check out that Crop Protection Network, and a lot of nice resources on there. Plus our Extension Crops website also has a lot of nice information as well. And we put stuff out on the Minnesota Crop News. If things are going to be kind of heating up again this summer, hopefully we won't have another big disease years, but who knows? So we know tar spot's something we got to be out looking for kind of every year, I guess, now too, but hopefully southern rust will stay south. But again, we want to thank our sponsors, the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. And just a reminder, next week we will have strategies for winning the war against water hemp.